As Marines move in, is the US preparing the final blow in Iran? Friday's deadline for Trump's ultimatum to Tehran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz or have its energy infrastructure obliterated is rapidly approaching. Over 2,000 US Marines and 3 warships are due to arrive in the region tomorrow. Trump said many points have been agreed. Iran said they have not. Israel says this morning it killed Iran's Navy chief overseeing the Hormuz blockade. Meanwhile, Iran's death toll has risen to almost 2,000. So will they reach an agreement, or will we see US boots on the ground? Murtaza Hussain covers national security and foreign affairs at Dropsite News. He joins me now. Murtaza, welcome to MEE Live. We want to get your thoughts as Trump's ultimatum deadline approaches. What's more likely, ground invasion or some sort of agreement?
Well, it's hard to say with the certainty because of the fact that Trump obviously has engaged in very high pressure bargaining tactics before in this conflict and even other aspects of his political career. That said, from what we have heard, there is not really any prospect of a diplomatic agreement in any foreseeable time frame right now. The positions between the two sides are quite far apart. What we heard this morning was that the U.S. has not responded to the Iranian response to their 15 points for ending the war. So it's really difficult to see a diplomatic off-ramp. At the same time, an invasion of Iran or a ground operation, there aren't really clear, easy options for that either. They're not really clear wins that could be used to deliver what the U.S. has talked about as a final blow that would ostensibly end the conflict or force Iran to capitulate and so forth. The U.S. could theoretically seize a number of different strategic islands in the Persian Gulf that have some strategic use to Iran. They could launch a ground operation in the Strait itself on the Iranian side to try to suppress Iranian fire there. Or they could try to launch a raid deep into Iran to seize enriched uranium from Iran's nuclear program as sort of a political exclamation point onto the war to say that it was won. But none of those are very easy operations, and none of them have a clear prospect of success or delivering capitulation to the Iranians one way or another. So I think it's really a very difficult situation that there's not a negotiated ending, and nor is there a short-term political solution that can be achieved militarily. So if I were to bet, I would say we are actually heading towards an escalation, which would entail some sort of a ground component. But I don't see that ending the war on any foreseeable time frame thereafter.
Thank you. I just want to go a bit more into each of those sort of two options. You talked about negotiations. Their positions seem to be very far apart, and this sort of 15-point plan that Trump's put forward. What can you tell us about what Trump's demands are and how realistic they are?
Well, Trump's demands, most of them reflect what were the demands before the war in any case. They want zero uranium enrichment inside Iran, total dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program, so to speak, the vast majority of it, limits on Iranian ballistic missiles, capitulation on its support for other militant groups in the Middle East. And in return, they would get sanctions relief and some cooperation for their civilian nuclear program. But the thing is, those demands are basically the same as what they were before the war, as I said. But the situation has changed from before the war because the whole idea that the Iranian government would collapse quickly in the face of decapitation strikes or even weeks of bombing by the U.S. and Israel has shown itself to not be the case. The Iranian government, one way or another, was much more resilient than had been imagined by the U.S. and Israel. So, that realization has not at least yet resulted in the shifting of America's bargaining position in the war. And on top of the survivability of the government, they also seem to have a significant ability to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, to drive the U.S. out of military bases in the region. There's some estimates 13 to 17 military bases have been evacuated entirely during the war. So, all these things would logically seem to suggest some sort of modification of bargaining positions, recognizing that Iran actually does have some leverage in the
Are
situation.
you saying that
But I think the
actually
problem
Iran's
is now that
negotiating?
it's
Sorry, are you saying
for
that
a
actually
losing
Iran's
face,
negotiating
and
position
the
is
U.S. would
better
lose face if
now?
they were to do that.
Sorry, Murtaza, I just want to clarify. Are you saying that Iran's negotiating position is actually better now than before Trump initiated this war?
I would say so, definitely. And it's not just me saying that. Even publications which are more pro-war at the start, like The Economist, had a cover actually conceding that the strategic initiative is now with Iran. And that's not to dismiss the fact that they've taken tremendous losses, and many of their leadership and personnel have been killed. Lots of destruction of their defense industrial base as well, too. But after almost a month of fighting, the missile program has not been halted. The drone strikes have not stopped. They haven't been able to suppress Iranian fire. And the most intense phase from the air campaign usually is the beginning of it. So the coercive ability actually decreases over time. So if that's the case, then Iranian leverage has improved tremendously as a result of the war. But to concede that would be very damning from the U.S. position, because it leads to the question of why did you launch the war then to improve their position?
Okay, so then
So I
let's talk
think that
about
now
the
the question
so
to
then let's talk
gamble
about the
and
other
say, I
option,
think
which is
escalate, could you reduce their leverage? That's where we are now.
So then let's talk about the other option, which is escalation, if indeed that is the case. Iranian officials have said that they don't trust Trump's negotiation push, and they see it as a ruse to launch sneak attacks. I just want to read you this tweet from Iran's parliamentary speaker. He said, based on some intelligence reports, Iran's enemies are preparing to occupy one of the Iranian islands with support from one of the regional countries. Our forces are monitoring all enemy movements. First, Murtaza, any idea who this regional ally could be?
Well, his statement didn't name the country that he was leveling this accusation towards. But if you notice, in the last 72 hours, there's been a very vocal public campaign by the United Arab Emirates escalating their own rhetoric towards Iran, and basically demanding regime change in Iran as a condition of the war in sum and substance. So, if you know the history between Iran and the UAE, there are a number of disputed islands in the Persian Gulf that the UAE has claimed sovereignty over for many, many decades, and that Iran has likewise said it belongs to them. So one can imagine that this territorial dispute now, like in a situation where the UAE is doing a lot to egg on the continuation of the war, may now manifest in a conflict over one of those islands. And the islands are Abu Musa Island and Tumb Island in the Persian Gulf that this dispute exists over. So, while one cannot say determinatively, and there are other possible candidates that Ghalibaf could be referring to, it does strike to reason that it could be the UAE in the situation, and they could be preparing for a conflict over Abu Musa or Tum.
If that situation does occur, and these strategic islands are potentially seized by US troops, what would this mean for Iran's control of the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, I don't think it would end the conflict by any means, and I don't think it would return control, navigation, freedom of navigation to the strait, because of the fact that even if you were to significantly, well, actually, let me say it this way: Iran is not actually firing on the strait that much to make it inoperable for troops to pass, sorry, for ships to pass. You only need to fire, a drone every week and hit a ship or threaten a ship enough that insurers will not deem it feasible to ensure the transit through the strait. You really need 100% security over the strait to do that. And what's happened now is we've had basically a revolution in military affairs as a result of the proliferation of cheap and effective drone technology. So in the past, if the Iranians were to want to shut down the strait, they'd have to park these large corvettes in the strait and shut down ships physically. And those corvettes could be destroyed by airstrikes or by the U.S. Navy or anybody else. But if you really just need a drone fired maybe from tens or hundreds of kilometers inland from Iran, and that's enough to shut down the strait, just doing it once in a while, then occupying the island doesn't really solve the problem at all. More likely, actually, the troops who sit on that island They will need to be logistically provided for by some capacity. Those logistics chains could be hit by these drones. And the troops sitting there will just be sitting ducks for Iranian drone and ballistic missile attacks. So it really doesn't make a lot of sense, to be honest, unless you're imagining that this will cause the collapse of the Iranian government and armed forces. So it does strike me as sort of a move of desperation.
Thank you, Murtaza. Now, of course, America, the USA, and Iran are not the only two decisive parties in this. There is also Israel. Say Trump and Tehran come to some sort of agreement. Do you think that Israel would even comply with those terms, or would they press on with the war?
Well, if you look at the conflict from the perspective of Israeli or American national interests, it's clear that the interests diverge here because the U.S. wants to return to the pre-war status quo, where there was a relatively stable Persian Gulf, and they were the security guarantor for that, and the Gulf Arab countries were on their side, and so forth. And that requires some sort of stability, some sort of probably a negotiated agreement with someone in Iran to help allow them to return to that situation. The Israeli perspective is very different. They would be fine with and probably prefer a situation of total chaos in the Persian Gulf, where Iran collapses into an ungoverned state or partially governed state. There's civil war perhaps in Iran, and even if that spills out and disrupts the Persian Gulf and impacts the Persian Gulf Arab countries as well too, they'll be okay with that. And if the situation even escalates to total destruction, systematic destruction of energy infrastructure in Iran and in Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and all these countries, that's also okay from an Israeli perspective and maybe even beneficial because it would destroy not just Iran but also the Gulf Arab countries with whom it has relations with some, but ultimately they are some rival power center in the Middle East besides Israel. And if it triggers a global economic depression, then that will impact everyone, and Israel included. But perhaps they feel that the strategic benefit will be better. So the problem is that there's this clear difference of preferences between the two sides. But the American government has been heavily infiltrated by supporters of Israel who've warped U.S. foreign policy to reflect Israeli interests. And that's not just me saying that. It was the former deputy director of national intelligence. It was resigned recently for this over this subject. And you see people like Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner involved in U.S. diplomacy. They're prioritizing Israeli interests over American interests. So because of this fact, it's hard to untangle the two positions. And we may be heading to a situation where Israeli interests are satisfied, but American interests are grievously harmed, along with everybody else in the region.
Murtaza Hussain, Dropsite News, thank you for your insights. And to everyone watching, thanks for tuning in.